Hi, nice to see everybody. As Richard introduced, so I'm going to be talking about the sleep and physical research theme, physical activity research theme, which sort of developed, I think, in the first iteration of ICEP. So we found some very interesting findings regarding the role of sleep and physical activity in cancer prevention. We wanted to sort of draw out more about the mechanisms of the potential role of sleep and physical activity within ICEP2. So I'm going to talk about some features of how we've been able to do that. And as both sleep and physical activity are obviously closely linked with metabolic health and obesity, these will still be areas that we will want to leverage during the next iteration of the obesity cancer epidemiology programme. So what have we been doing over the last 5 years? So we've been investigating the role of sleep and physical activity in breast, ovarian, colorectal and prostate cancer, where they've all been implicated. We've been conducting a series of different epidemiological approaches, so genetic epidemiology, systematic reviews, as well as some qualitative analysis in an attempt to sort of triangulate evidence regarding the role of sleep and physical activity in cancer. We've been leveraging both self-report clinical data on in sleep in particular, as well as newly available wearable data from large-scale studies such as the UK Biobank to more objectively quantify measures of sleep and physical activity. And through our fourth translational work package, we've been commencing routes to translation with some sleep and physical activity interventions. So a few highlights. So specifically, so Richard sort of gave me flashbacks to the news day that I had, where there was a lot of interest in some work that we've been doing, uncovering the potential relevance of sleep in breast cancer. We've been extending this over a number of years now to look more deeply at various sleep traits in relation to cancer, uncovering a protective role of morning chronotypes, that's a morning preference on breast and prostate cancer, as well as a potential detrimental effect of insomnia on both ovarian cancer incidence and survival. With respect to physical activity, we found strong evidence that reduced sedentary time lowers breast cancer risk, but that screen time in itself is unlikely to be a causal risk factor for cancer. We've looked in more depth using a series of molecular epidemiological approaches to investigate the mechanisms underlying the effects observed, which include hormonal, adiposity and inflammatory pathways. And as mentioned, we've been conducting some feasibility trials to examine the impact of physical activity levels on cancer survival, and have been developing sleep interventions for smokers. So a few highlights. So this is the work of Christos and Irene, who work with Kostas at University of Ioannina, which is closely linked within this programme. And they've been conducting a really systematic approach to evaluate the role of sleep in relation to reproductive cancers. So the paper on the left is a series of observational and Mendelian randomization studies looking at 6 different sleep characteristics in relation to the reproductive cancers, and finding overall limited evidence for an effect of sleep on reproductive cancers. So I mentioned specifically previous findings showed sleep to be potentially important for breast and prostate. But here we extended the work to look also at endometrial and epithelial ovarian cancers, where the evidence was less consistent. And then on the right is a systematic review, which is currently under review in sleep medicine, which has looked specifically at observational evidence, looking at various sleep traits in reproductive cancers. And this has highlighted in particular a potentially important role of chronotype in breast cancer, which we've obviously shown from our work to exist, but it's also highlighting potentially the role of clinical insomnia in breast cancer, which is an area particularly of interest. So I wanted next to highlight two is to describe the work of Bryony Hayes, who was a PhD student linked with ICEP and is now a postdoc worker with myself and Emma Vincent. So Bryony was supported by the Bristol and Western Hospitals charity for her PhD, specifically to look at extending this investigation of sleep and breast cancer. And the work that she's doing now, which has been funded by the University of Bristol Cancer Research Fund, is investigating the role of clinical insomnia based on both diagnosis and medication use and breast cancer in the All of Us study. So a lot of the work that we've done so prior to now has been using data mainly from European cohort studies. The UK Biobank in particular has been particularly useful for the sort of work we do. But obviously with the limitation that that we can only really extrapolate our findings to European ancestry individuals, and it's very important to look at more diverse cohorts and investigate whether the same risk factors are influencing cancer risk in other ancestries. So the All of Us study is enabling us to do that, to look in European, African American, East Asian and Hispanic groups. And it's very small here, I'm afraid, but this is just showing the results of some genome-wide association studies that Bryony has been running in this cohort for insomnia, but also in relation to breast cancer risk. And highlighting across the different ancestries, you can see a very small signal, but quite high up. So that's indicating a very strong genetic association between a genetic variant in the WSB1 gene in relation to clinical insomnia. So this is a variant that hasn't been identified before in previous genetic studies of insomnia, but it's potentially very interesting to us. And this variant is linked with the regulation of metastatic potential, particularly in HR-negative breast cancer, but it's potentially giving us some insight into mechanism. So this is very exciting and still very new work that Bryony has been doing, but something that we're continuing to work on. Another highlight, so this is sort of work that's cross-cutting both the sleep physical activity theme and also the smoking theme. So there's work of Angela Atwood and Jasmine Kuja looking at smoking cessation, nicotine and the relationship with sleep. So the study on the left is some work of former PhD student Jo Matthews, who's been looking at the role of sleep in quit attempts of smokers and highlighting the range of sleep problems that could increase the risk of relapse. And as part of this study, Ange and Jo also looked at the potential for cognitive behavioural therapy in insomnia as something that could be potentially tailored to individuals who are trying to quit smoking and who have sort of these common insomnia symptoms. The study on the right is another genetic Mendelian randomization study that we've been performing to investigate the role of nicotine separate from smoking in relation to sleep behaviours. So obviously now with more people moving to e-cigarettes and the transition from cigarettes to vaping, we're interested in investigating specifically the role of nicotine on sleep traits, and that we were able to do this within the Mendelian randomization framework to separate nicotine from smoke exposure. Also the sort of other constituents of cigarettes, to suggest limited evidence for an impact of nicotine on insomnia, suggesting that nicotine itself doesn't strongly impact more chronic problematic sleep behaviours. So another key highlight, so this is work, a large body of work that Sarah Lewis has been leading, which is linked with both ICEP, but then also a large World Cancer Research Fund grant that Sarah was awarded a few years ago, to delve into the mechanisms underlying the protective role of physical activity in relation to a number of different cancers. As part of this analysis, we've investigated a series of potential mediators of the relationship, so metabolites, proteins, sex hormones, and insulin signaling pathways. And just a sort of overview of results is a finding of a phospholipid in particular that was uncovered as potentially being an important mediator of the physical activity to colorectal cancer link that was uncovered by Nikos, who was at IOC, and now at Yanina. Lucy Goodsword, who's here today, has been looking at a range of proteins, so in relation to the 4 different cancer types, and uncovering a number of potential important proteins that are mediating the link. And while we've found limited evidence for a mediating role of sex hormones, again, there's some potential interesting pathways in insulin signaling. The question mark here is that IGF is implicated in both the relationship between physical activity and insulin, so and IGF-1, and then IGF-1 in relation to both breast and colorectal cancer, although the sort of directionality is a little bit unclear. So we're unsure whether this is actually serving as a true mediator, but it's nonetheless an interesting finding. And the final highlight, so this is more related to the translational work package, is this work that Miranda Armstrong has been leading, looking at e-bikes, providing physical activity amongst those particularly with breast and prostate cancer. So as a feasibility study indicating that users have greatly enjoyed e-cycling, large retention of participants, particularly with prostate cancer in this study, the people with prostate cancer continuing to cycle after the loan period, so indicating this as a very positive intervention to positive impacts of physical and mental health outcomes of those diagnosed. In terms of outputs of this research theme, so we have over 20 publications across all 4 of the work packages in ICEP. So as mentioned, a lot of the work we've done in sleep and physical activity has used the Mendelian randomization approach. We've investigated molecular mechanisms. We've also done some work using DNA methylation as a predictive biomarker in relation to shift work and circadian disruption. This is something that I'll be talking a little bit more about this afternoon. And then finally, as mentioned, this area has been really ripe for the development of interventions, and we've conducted a number of such feasibility studies in this area. In terms of sort of additional outputs, so sort of offshoot grants have been awarded. So I mentioned the World Cancer Research Fund grant of Sarah Lewis's. There's a number of other awards that have been awarded to more junior researchers. So Christos as a WCR Inspire Award, and myself and Bryony, the University Cancer Research Fund, and there are a number of other grants that are currently either being prepared or under review as well. And I just also finally wanted to say that a number of these awards have been put together and developed in conjunction with the PPIE group. So we have had a lot of feedback on these, on the development of these bids with PPIE input, which has been really invaluable. And so obviously we're keeping our fingers crossed that some more of these will be funded and carried on after the end of ICEP as well.